This discussion is just so important and very timely, as we're beginning to build momentum across the country. Because over the past several years, you'll notice that individuals and groups have started to look at how we memorialize people, who's chosen, who's not chosen, who's portrayed, who's not portrayed, who's marginalized, who is not mentioned at all.
Hello, welcome to Cambridge Forum, a very special Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, the Director of Cambridge Forum, and today we're delighted to be partnering with Harvard Square Business Association to consider an appropriate topic at this portentous historic moment on the eve of Biden's inauguration. The topic is Markers and Reminders, Martin Luther King Jr. to Black Lives Matter. In today's program, we will examine the significance of landmarks, sometimes local and in our own neighborhoods, which remain perhaps invisible to us, yet may act as important reminders of individuals and events that have shaped our past. To help us in our reconnaissance, we are starting right here in Cambridge with Denise Jillson from Harvard Square Business Association and Denise Simmons, Cambridge City Councillor. After which we'll cross the river to meet Imari Paris Jeffries, Executive Director of King Boston, who will highlight the plans for the upcoming 22-foot-high memorial, The Embrace, consisting of 4 intertwined bronze arms signifying the social values espoused by Dr. King and Coretta Scott King. We'll close the program on a high musical note with the Squares in the Square performing Martin, Are You Still Marching? So, welcome everybody. So let's begin with Denise Jillson, the Executive Director of the Harvard Square Business Association, who's a tour de force in Cambridge. Last August, following the death of George Floyd, Denise decided to create a series of 13 videos entitled Black Lives Matter to Harvard Square. With the help of the Cambridge Historical Tours, she made 13 short dramatized videos which chronicled the lives of outstanding men and women, each fascinating in his or her own right, who had made some significant contribution to social and racial justice, to voting rights, to education, or gender equality. They started with Martin Luther King Jr. and they ended with the Obamas. If you haven't seen them, you should check them out. They're on the website. So Denise, warm welcome to you. Perhaps you'd be good enough to tell us about why you wanted to remind people about these people. They had such large lives and historic connections to Harvard Square. And why is it important for us not to forget them?
Well, Mary, thank you. And thank you for having me. This is a timely program. Having just celebrated MLK Day yesterday and our inauguration tomorrow. So we're bookended by 2 very important events. But before I begin, maybe I should just talk just briefly about the Harvard Square Business Association, which was founded in 1910. And for the past 110 years, our mission has been to promote commerce in Harvard Square while being good stewards of the public space. And as you know, there are dozens of markers and reminders of important historical significance in and around the square in the public space. And in fact, several years ago, I worked with Ben Mayer and now City Councillor Denise Simmons on a very special memorial to Prince Hall, which is installed on the Cambridge Common. And, you know, last summer, we were doing, a series of videos about these historical markers. And during that period of time, at the height of it, of our productions here on just historical revolutionary type markers in the square, we had the murder of George Floyd. And that sort of stopped us in our tracks. And, you know, we used his death. It was the catalyst for our project. We took an earnest look at what the movement meant to Harvard Square, our community, and how are we impacted, and how are we going to respond? how are we going to respond to this important and momentous time in our history as a country? Now, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement, as you know, started in 2013, but the struggle has been in this country since its beginning. And we wanted to realize that and commemorate it. And I had thought about the Prince Hall Memorial and, you know, realized there were other markers in the square, and worked with Daniel Berger-Jones, who was the, you know, founder of Cambridge Historical Tours. And I don't think anybody knows more about the markers in Harvard Square than Daniel. So, you know, we talked with him and said, look, we want to commemorate markers just to Black men and women. And how many do we have? And where are they? And what do they mean to us? And Daniel, of course, knew them all. And we began to do the research and really put together these videos. And it was so interesting because we finished the video project around mid-August. And we thought, how are we going to roll these out? And, you know, we began looking at dates and realized that August 28th was the 57th anniversary, August 28th, 2020, was the 57th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And, you know, so we were going to originally roll them out using, going in chronological order, starting with Prince Hall. And because of the anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King's speech, we said, well, we'll go out of sequence the first time. So the first video that we rolled out was on August 28th. And we did that video at 8:46 a.m. and for 13 consecutive days at 8:46 a.m. in commemoration of the amount of time, the powerful reminder of the devastating minutes and seconds that George Floyd was pinned to the ground before he died. And the final video, as it happened, 13 days later, was released on September 9th, which was also a fitting and a significant date because on that date in 1957, September 9th, 1957, Dwight Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, signed the Civil Rights Act. So as we are bookended here today, or in the middle of, you know, the MLK Day yesterday, the inauguration tomorrow, the videos were bookended by these very two significant dates. And, you know, if you haven't seen the videos, I encourage people to watch them. We give a little sort of warning that some of them are incredibly graphic, they're provocative, but they're important. And the reason they're important because we must never forget.
So I think it took quite a long time from inception to creation of the memorial. And I was going to move now over to Denise Simmons, who herself is another formidable figure in Cambridge. As well as being a lifelong resident of Cambridge, Denise is currently serving her 9th term as Cambridge City Councillor, in addition to having served 2 terms as mayor. Denise has blazed her own trail. 2008, she became the nation's first Black openly lesbian mayor, as well as Massachusetts' first Black female mayor. But much more than a headline, Denise has become very well known for her initiatives on housing, leadership, and her inclusive town hall style meetings. She remains firmly committed to fostering a better understanding of how city government can be of greater service to its citizens. So we applaud your efforts there, Denise. So welcome. 2 Denises in one program.
No, double your trouble, but it's good trouble. Mary, thank you so much. And I want a special thank you to the Cambridge Forum, to my very good friend, colleague, and troublemaker, Denise Jillson. I just want to pause to say this to Denise. When she talked about what she had been doing, it just reminded me about the work she does in the HSBA, which is proactive and not reactive. And people not waiting to be asked to make a difference and do something, but being forward thinking and doing something. And I'm just over the moon to be here with Imari Paris Jeffries, and we're going to hear about the work that he's doing. This discussion is just so important and very timely, as we're beginning to build momentum across the country. Because over the past several years, you'll notice that individuals and groups have started to look at how we memorialize people, who's chosen, who's not chosen, who's portrayed, who's not portrayed, who's marginalized, who is not mentioned at all. And I think that's really accelerated in the final year of that person's presidency that is coming to a merciful end very, very soon. But I'm someone who has always had history in the center of my life, sitting at my grandmother's knee and listening to her stories and my mother's stories, and how that shaped my own life. And then living in a city which is so rich and dynamic in history, but as you mentioned, some people's histories have continued to be hidden out of view. And so I think it's important that we look at the symbolism that's communicated by our street names, our buildings, our monuments, our public art, because to me, they always beg the question, whose story are we telling? Just recently, I'm sure a lot of people had the opportunity, I hope they had the opportunity to see either live or on the Disney Channel, Hamilton, and there's this piece that they do, and they says, who lives, who dies, who tells your story? And I think that is just so profound. Who tells your story? And how's that story told? And sometimes it's very outward by way of a monument. Sometimes it's subtle by who's not memorialized in that monument. So we must realize that the stories we pass down from generation to generation that have been ingrained in our collective subconscious are intentional choices that we as a society have made. And that means that we actively choose to elevate certain stories and certain individuals. And this also means that we have actively chose to exclude certain people and certain individuals from telling our collective story. And so these are the things that I've been thinking about as I was first settling into my role as a city councillor 20 years ago, it seems just like yesterday, attending on Memorial Day observances, Patriots Day observances on the historic Cambridge Common, I started to pay more attention to the monuments and memorials that were there. And I started to want to know more about the city of Cambridge and who chose to erect the statues and who they chose to honor on this historic plot of land. And so the Common, as you know, is known far and wide as the spot that General Washington took control of the Continental Army and launched the Revolutionary War. It's a point of pride. It's a pivotal moment that occurred right here in the heart of our city. But as a history enthusiast, I knew that there was another story that wasn't being told, or I should say, elements of Washington's story in the Revolutionary period were being left out. We know that George Washington didn't engage in the struggle to extricate the colonies from the British. He didn't rouse the 13 American colonies to declare their independence by themselves. He didn't fight for the War of Independence by himself, and he surely didn't form this, what we now call the United States of America, by himself. And my thoughts began to turn toward the figures who had been left out of that narrative. And one of the people who represents that is Prince Hall. And Denise showed us the memorial of Prince Hall that's on the Common now. And that little piece of paper that's taped to the bottom is a picture of John Lewis. At the time this picture was taken, John Lewis had just died, and someone felt that it would be fitting to put that there. I think it's now gone, but so I think about this monument and why this monument was important to me. This man named Prince Hall was a man of color who lobbied for people of color to be allowed to fight in Washington's army. And he was a very early abolitionist movement mover. And when we think of Black Lives Matter, I would even say he was a part of the Black Lives Matter. Didn't call it that then. So 313 years ago, Black Lives Mattered, and they mattered to Prince Hall, and he wanted to do something about it. So he goes to George Washington and he says, I want to be a part of this struggle. I want to be a part of this movement toward freedom. So he did two things. He petitioned George Washington to allow the enslaved people to fight. 5,000 of those people fought, men and women. But he also did something else, which was he started the Prince Hall organization that is, I think, more than 1 million members now and across the country. And the idea was for this whole idea of freedom. And so it was important for me that we tell that story here in Cambridge. So 2 centuries, Prince Hall was this figure that was outside of history. His name wasn't heard very much except in Prince Hall circles. There was no real, I think there's only one other monument to him that is in this country. And so it was important for me that we raise him up. And I'll just say very, very briefly, and Mary, you stop me if I'm going too long. You know, I got together with 2 other gentlemen, Red Mitchell and the Prince Hall historian. We started talking about, let's raise this monument to this man. 2 things I want to say very quickly. It wasn't easy. One thing that you want to notice about the Prince Hall monument is it stands shorter than the Washington Monument. And that's because we were not allowed to have Prince Hall's monument the equivalent height as the Washington Monument. And in this picture, you can't see the 2 because some of the people that were voting, and I don't want to shame people, felt that Washington was more prominent than Prince Hall. And so we took about a foot off these marble markers to comply with the governing board that was going to give us the permission to put this monument on the common. It took us about 5 years. We had to raise about $150,000 to do it. And that was just one obstacle because there was a lot of misinformation. You'll notice about this monument, there is no rendering of Prince Hall himself. Excuse me, because we don't know what Prince Hall actually looked like. And so one of the things that was important was that we didn't perpetuate any untruths by putting a monument up with his likeness, because it clearly would not have been him. And so we went through this process without having any guiding principle. And I say guiding principle because right now we're in the midst of the city council. The city manager just appointed a committee, monuments, markers, and public art. And our job in this committee will be to look at monuments, markers, and public art across the city to see who's being memorialized, and if they committed any what we called egregious acts, and who's not, and develop some sort of guiding principle on how going forward we will commemorate people in Cambridge that have done good works in Cambridge. And that report should be coming out sometime in the summer, and I hope to have the opportunity to come back and talk a little bit about that. But just a little bit more briefly, as we were doing this work on erecting this monument to Prince Hall, and again, Denise Jillson, one of my co-conspirators in Good Trouble, sat on one of the committees that looked at the art that was presented to us to put on the monument. When we were doing this, this is a couple of things that jumped out at us. On the rotunda, where the monument sits, there are 2 or 3 cannons that come from Prince George's Island, the Washington Monument, and 2 headstone type markers. One is to Thaddeus Kosciuszko. Now let's talk about the one about Thaddeus Kosciuszko, because the story that's not told is about Agrippa Hull. Agrippa Hull was an African in the colonies who would stand alongside Thaddeus Kosciuszko, but no one memorialized him, and fought in the Revolutionary War. He lived in Shelburne, Mass, and there's a lot about him. If you go look him up in Shelburne, Mass, there's nothing about him here in Cambridge, where he was a part of this big monumental moment, which is the Revolutionary War, or Cato Freeman, or Neptune Frost. The other person that you don't see as a part of this memorializing of the Revolutionary period is when you look at the Washington Monument. And I'm sure if you close your eyes and think about all the pictures you've seen of Prince Hall, you'll see this sort of a Black man, short in stature, William Billy Mays. No one knows who he is. He was with Washington through the entire Revolutionary period, but nobody memorializes him. And that's some of the work that we still have to do. We have to be very intentional about what I said in a speech in 2009 about rewriting history and taking people out of the margins and putting them in the center part of our history. So it's important for us to reflect on this, because for all the upheaval and the turmoil playing out on the front pages of 2021, we have very little sense of our own events, of our own lives, how we will be remembered, and how people whose shoulders we stand on will be remembered. So we want to certainly leave signposts to help us better understand that narrative in context. I could go on, but
well, I think you raised a very good point, Denise, about what is history and whose history. And I think the one good thing that's happened in recent years, partly because of the storytelling, stories from the screen, the moth, people start to realize that everyone has a story, and they're just as important, actually, sometimes more important than the person that gets the monument. So I think we're changing our recollection, or should I say enhancing and enriching our recollection of history. Yes. Because we're hearing about the others, yes, the women, the minorities, all the others, the Latinos, the Hispanics, the Native Americans. So I think this is a good time. If this has shaken us up a bit, this awful thing we had happen last week, maybe it's made us come to our senses some ways and clarified our vision. So I think you raised some good points there. Before we discuss about how we remember our past, because I'd like to go back to that, I'd like to move across the river now. We're going over to Boston, and we're expanding our lens from the local to the national. I'm very pleased to introduce the Executive Director of King Boston, Imari Paris Jeffries. Imari brings a wealth of experience in nonprofit management and social and community activism to this project. Welcome to you, Imari. Thank you for making the time. And I want you to tell us a little bit about how you got involved with this massive project, which is going to be a large, Denise, 22-foot high, thankfully, memorial dedicated to Dr. and Coretta Scott King. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about why it's so important. Why is it especially important to have it in Boston?
You know, I think both of the Denises set the stage to talk about the King Memorial. You know, I've heard some folks refer to this moment in time as the third Reconstruction. And so there's a lot of things happening in Boston, Cambridge, and in the Commonwealth that has led us into these moments. You know, I saw a meme the other day, was something like, you know, I wish I knew when the good old days happened so that I could enjoy the fact that I was in the good old days. And so I think this is one of those moments where, you know, I wish I knew when the third Reconstruction happened so I could respond and move accordingly. And so my announcement on the forum today is that we are in that third Reconstruction, and not because Imari said so, because I think the evidence is saying so. You know, when I think about a Denise Simmons and an Ayanna Pressley and D.A. Rollins and you know, the top law enforcement officials in Boston and Cambridge being people of color, when I think about the incoming potential mayor of Boston being an African-American woman, when I think about the emergence of the two largest foundations, the Barr Foundation and the Boston Foundation, being run by a Latinx person and an African-American person, and Hyams also being run by an African-American, a Black woman. We're seeing an emergence of civic and elected leaders throughout the Commonwealth. The passing of, while not perfect, the passing of the police reform bill in Massachusetts. A lot of things have happening. I think the Spotlight series a few years ago articulated what was not working in Massachusetts. I think the surveys about Massachusetts being the most unfriendly place in America, the most not welcoming place. I think we teeter between 9 and 10th a few times, below Charlotte, North Carolina. I think we've seen and heard these things, and I think a lot of us have been paying attention. And I think the emergence of our local civic and national elected leaders is a part of that. And as a result, it has paved the way for the Embrace Memorial to be erected in Boston Common. The Embrace Memorial, a memorial to honor Dr. and Mrs. King, as well as Boston and Cambridge civil rights leaders, is only possible because it's possible in Massachusetts, because Massachusetts is ready. And so it's a symbol to let us and the country know that Boston is a city, the Commonwealth is a place where people are welcome. It is emblematic of the beloved community that Dr. King talked about. It is part of this garment of destiny, which we're all interwoven into. We're in a moment in time where stone and steel is not enough when we talk about markers and memorials. We have to move beyond that. The Daughters of the American Confederacy built 425 memorials, most of which were erected in the 1920s. And these were markers that said, you are not welcomed here. These are our heroes. Be very afraid. Don't be here after dark. This is what we're about. And I think we are unapologetically naming what this memorial is about for the Commonwealth and for Boston. Boston is a city that strives to be the city on the hill. We strive to open the Commonwealth post-pandemic as the most welcoming city, as the most anti-racist city, as an abolitionist city, and I'm including Cambridge and Somerville and other surrounding communities. I think that's what we aspire to be. And so this memorial is our promise ring. If you look at it from the top, it looks like a ring. And so we're putting a ring on it in the common. And so that ring is a commitment to each other, that we are committed to being that place. And I'm looking forward, at least in Boston, to this upcoming mayoral race, and imagining that the debate question for that race would be, what would it take for Boston, Cambridge, and the Commonwealth to move from number 9th or 15th or whatever number we are as the unfriendly, unwelcoming city to number 1? What type of systemic racism structures that we must break down? What type of symbols and images we must erect? How do we fight environmental injustice, housing injustice, food insecurity in the region in order for this to be a welcoming place? And so this new memorial is emblematic of all of these aspirations. And we imagine it being unveiled in 2022. It's an exciting time. And I think it's only possible because of a Denise Simmons, because of an Ayanna Pressley, because of a Rachel Rawlings, because of a mayor in waiting, Kim Janey. That's the only reason why a memorial like this is possible in this period of time. And so I'm so excited to be a part of it.
So before we talk about the role of art and music in motivating us to social action, or our consciences are activated by them, was there a long story to getting this to come into fruition, or was it pretty easy because he's such a well-known, respected figure? Or was this a long, hard struggle? Do you know anything about how they came to decide upon the site, how they got permission? What's the backstory? So I know Paul English was the original person.
Right. Yes, and Paul English is still the co-chair and one of the co-founders, along with Liz Walker, Reverend Liz Walker. And so, rumor has it, legend has it, that Mayor Menino had this idea of honoring Dr. King, who, as we know, both Dr. and Mrs. King came here in the 50s as college students. And so when we think about the region, Boston, Cambridge as a college town, we are the 4th largest college town in the country, 9th largest city. And so the other college towns match the population size. So New York is the largest college town. LA is number 2, Chicago's number 3, Boston's number 4. Fourth largest college town, ninth largest city. Roughly between 375 to 400,000 students come to Massachusetts or live in Massachusetts to go to school, anywhere from a bachelor's to an associate's to a doctoral degree. And so the Kings were a part of that population of students. Mrs. King went to New England Conservatory, Dr. King went to Boston University in the 50s. And so we imagine what it must have been like during that time in Boston and Cambridge and the surrounding areas. And we imagine also what it would be like for Boston to have been friendly enough, safe enough for Black and brown folks, for the Kings to decide that they want to stay in Boston, like many college students who come to schools in Cambridge and schools in Boston. What would it have been like for them to stay, and made Boston and New England the epicenter of the civil rights movement? How would this region have been today? And so 65 years later from the time they were in school, 55 years later from the 1965 Freedom March, 66 years later, we have that opportunity to imagine what it would be like for Boston and Cambridge to be the epicenter of the abolition movement. And so this memorial is a part of that process. And so a few years ago, Paul English and Reverend Liz Walker had this idea of honoring Dr. King. It emerged from honoring Dr. King to honoring Dr. King and Mrs. King. And so there was a contest where there was a call for proposals. 126 proposals from across the world were submitted. 5 finalists were selected: Hank Willis Thomas and Mass Design. Mass Design is a local architectural firm with a national, international reach. Hank Willis Thomas is a internationally renowned African Black sculptor, and it was responsible for many pieces, including some of the ones at the National Lynching Museum. That selection was selected by a committee of artists, by a committee of community members, and through a community vote. And so we were fortunate to have such a beautiful piece be selected through a community process, because sometimes they don't match up. You can have a community process, but you don't get the type of artistic value that some folks want. And I feel like we hit a right mark there. And we've been raising money and trying to erect a memorial ever since, and that was in 2017, 2018. And so erecting it in Boston Common, again, America's oldest public park, was no easy task. There had been a moratorium on any type of building in the Common for 27 years. And so there was a lot of work that my predecessor and mentor, Marie St. Fleur, had to do in regard to not only going through the process, but getting the moratorium lifted. And so we are at the final stages with the Arts Commission and the Landmarks Commission. We're doing an archaeological testing and a geotechnical testing. Archaeological to make sure that there's no baby dinosaur bones in Boston Common, and geotechnical to make sure that we don't accidentally cut those green line. If you ever rode the green line back in the day, you know what I'm talking about. We don't want to cut the green line's wires and setting up new lights. And so once we finish those 2 surveys, we meet with the commissions in February, hope to get the green light in March. It takes about 17 months to fabricate this piece, 22 stories or 22 feet high, 3 stories roughly. It's going to be fabricated off-site. There's about 3 refineries in the country that could do something this big. And so we're finalizing those details on that. And 2022, we hope to unveil it. And we also want to launch the Embrace Ideas Festival. So coinciding with the Embrace, there's 2 other parts: the King Center for Economic Justice and Embrace Ideas. And so the King Center will be located in Nubian Square. And so we really think about these 2 points in the map that mark the original route of the 1965 Freedom Rally, one of Dr. King's final campaigns. And so when Dr. King returned in 65, Dr. King, Mrs. King, and other activists, they marched with local civil rights leaders and marched for 4 themes: education, racial equity, housing, and poverty. And now we've really framed that around wealth. And so those are still the pathways to economic justice. And so the King Center will interrogate racism through those lenses. And so the King Center is a community research center, a art gallery space, a innovation space, a hub in Roxbury. And so it is in the historic center of Black Boston and the geographic center of Boston. The Embrace Memorial will be in Boston Common, which is the financial center of New England and the financial center of Boston. So these 2 points in the map, again, centering this work in communities is important, and also doing some placemaking. And so when we launch the memorial, when the memorial is unveiled, the third part of King Boston is Embrace Ideas. And so we think that it's important, I think now when this discourse around monuments and memorials has reached a boiling point, I think especially last summer, where we realized that it's no longer appropriate to erect these stone and steel structures to great men. And I think the mayor talked about folks that we've missed, people who were omitted, thinking about indigenous communities and the way that monuments are celebrated in their communities. They're not permanent. They're not fixed in the ground. And so we also have to talk about spatial justice. And so spatial justice is an important part of this monuments and memorials discourse. Where can people be safe? And I think spatial justice is relevant in the discourse around monuments and memorials. Where is representation for safety for folks? And so monuments and memorials are a part of that. Spatial justice is important when we talk about housing. In the 50s and 60s, spatial justice pertained to redlining. Where can Black and brown bodies feel safe? Can they feel safe in their homes? You can't feel safe in your home when you're redlined, or there's no rent control, or there's no affordable housing for you to have the home safety. We talk about spatial justice when it comes to law enforcement. And so 1/3 of killings by police officers happen during traffic stops, according to a recent study by Harvard. And so these pre-contextual stops are the beginning of a factor of Black people in state-sanctioned killings. And so can a Black body feel safe driving? And so spatial justice when it comes to monuments, memorials, transcends to housing, it transcends to police reform, it transcends to food security, it transcends to environmental security. When we talk about entertainment licenses in cities, Boston has 8 to 9 entertainment licenses that are owned by African Americans. And so when you are a visitor or a resident or just a casual passerby, if there is no places where you can feel safe, even being entertained, then you can't be safe in a city. And so spatial justice pertains to all the things that relate to economic justice, and particularly right now in this conversation around monuments and memorials.
Wow, you said a lot there, Imari. Thank you. Gave us a complete encapsulated view of the projected installation and the thinking that went behind it. Before we go back to that very important discussion we were just talking briefly about earlier, about what is a significant marker and who should it be to, and there's 2 things that came to mind. One is earlier last week, Denise Jillson helped an artist friend of mine put a portrait of Nina Simone into the kiosk in Harvard Square. It's 6 foot by 3 foot. Marks this beautiful woman who is both a musician and an activist her whole life. And then I was just thinking, this is the portrait here, it's absolutely spectacular. And I was also thinking about tomorrow, how this young poet, Amanda Gorman, is going to speak at the inauguration. She's from Harvard. Martin Luther King spoke at Harvard. It seemed like this beautiful cyclical thing to me. So just about art and music for a moment. How important do you think art and music are as agents of change? And why is it important for us to also mark those people as well as the statesmen and the military generals? Anyone can take that.
That's a very good question. And when I think about it, going back to who is represented, and just for a moment to pivot back to the Prince Hall Memorial, which is not of anyone in particular, it represents Prince Hall, but the one thing I didn't get to talk about was it represented the voices of the people of the time. And one of those voices was Mum Bet. Now, Mum Bet, Elizabeth Freeman, fought the Massachusetts General Court for her freedom, and her voice is elevated there. And so I meant to say it earlier, and I just wanted to bring us back to the elevations of voices and how we use the Prince Hall Monument to elevate voices that are not normally heard, not known, or not remembered. Now, the idea of art has always been a tremendous vehicle to say, to do a couple of things. First of all, to say what's on your heart, to bring about change. You know, we talk about the slave songs and how they would send messages to one group of people to another to say it's time to go, or I'm mourning, or how do I push forward? So art, and I'm thinking of music in this regard, has been a strong driving force, particularly in African American community, from spirituals all the way through to rap music, which I can't talk a bunch about because it's not I'm not of that generation per se, but I know that I have seen it open doors, particularly art, open doors and tell stories that have not been told or been allowed to be told in or as often as we would like. But I would like to hear a little bit from Imari on this, his thoughts.
You know, part of why Embrace Idea emerged as the actionable companion to the King Memorial, because the anti-racist discourse has been mostly before this time centered in policy, research, data, sometimes grassroots organizing. But there hasn't been a visible role for well-being, joy, and spatial justice. And so there has to be a way that we engage, and I think the mayor said it, our humanity in this anti-racist abolitionist discourse. And so at least from our attempt with Embrace Ideas, engaging arts, and and I think Denise has also been a practitioner, as a practitioner of this, engaging arts, music, the humanities, journalism, TED Talks, all of the ways that make us human has to be an additional way that we engage in anti-racist discourse. And so people ask me or others at the King Boston all the time, Imari, I want to do something, I heard you, I don't know what to do. And so if we were just the King Center, I would say, well, do you do research? Do you do policy? How does an average person get engaged in research and policy? I'm not sure what to tell them. But in order for us to combat racism, in order for us to not repeat systemic racism by doing the same things over and over again, we have to interrogate it differently. And that includes people doing work in the way that moves them. Dr. Kendi talks about us being socialized into racism, and the only way out of racism is not racism, is anti-racism. And so music and the arts have to be engaged into this discourse. So when people say, Imari, what can I do? I would say, you know what, I think it starts with engaging in music and the arts, or a book club, or with each other, with our humanity, to unsocialize or re-socialize ourselves into anti-racist forms of being. That can't be done with policy alone. It's not going to be done with research and data. It has to be done through social.
Sorry.
No problem. It has to be done through socialism, right? Through music, exactly, Mayor. It has to be done through music and the arts. And so I think we have to illuminate and raise up both parts simultaneously, both the arts as a way to engage in anti-racist discourse, as well as policy, research, data, and the type of memorial and monuments change that we've been talking about on this panel.
Can I just add, let's talk about the art and the work that Denise put in the kiosk, and talk about young people. And
Yes.
when I say young people, I'm talking about 7-year-olds and 8-year-olds while they're still impressionable, because I believe in passing the stories along. And my children will tell you they can't go anywhere and do anything that I don't have any long story about something. And so we go to the kiosk and we see Nina Simone, and my granddaughter, who's extraordinarily loquacious, ask me about it. And I take that moment as a teachable moment for her. And what I love about that the most is that I hear her tell it to somebody else, one of her little classmates, or to her mom. And that's how we make change. We have to, we don't do that enough, which is talk to our young people and pass on our stories, our stories of our history as a culture, as a city, as a gender, as you know, as an African-American woman or as an LGBT person. How do we pass those stories along? And art is a wonderful medium to do that through, by getting out. I guess, again, with me, getting out with my kids a lot and walking and going to these places and seeing these pieces and engaging them in conversation around that. And then they go and take that into their groups and their cohorts. And it's just a wonderful way to make change.
Before we actually listen to a piece of music that Denise helped organize the recording of last week in Harvard Square, which is very appropriate right now, you've made me think, all of you, when you're talking about this, how you bring history to life with voices. I once went to this incredible museum to immigration. It was right on the tip of one of these isolated parts of Kerry, looking out over the Atlantic. It was like a stone museum. Inside, they had the belongings of people that would be taken with them on their last trip, crossing the Atlantic to America. And they called it a wake, of course, because they never expected to see their family again. So they were treated as though they were dying. They were having a wake. So they had music, mournful and folky music, unaccompanied throughout this whole trip, walking around the museum. And you got a total sense of the feeling of leaving and separation, looking at these people's belongings, their letters, their suitcases. And I was thinking, what a great thing if we can create more moments and places devoted to people that we don't know about, or that have, these are nobodies. These are just people that emigrated, that formed the core of the country. They're nobody. So if we can do more of that in the arts, and I think this is a step, something like the King Center can be a whole invitation to that kind of voice, to hear from the people in all sorts of unexpected ways. I think it's a marvelous time. It's painful, but it's very important work. And I'm glad that you're all doing it and bringing it to the fore. So I don't want to finish with me, because we're going to finish with a piece of music, but does anyone want to add a final? I love that your little 7-year-old granddaughter now knows who Nina Simone is. That's pretty cool. We want to play the music too, right, Denise?
We did yesterday. So in celebration of Dr. King and Nina and the kiosk, which, by the way, when Mary and I were at the kiosk last week with Lenny Peterson, it was interesting because the kiosk is 500 square feet. It's been in the square since 1927. It's registered on the National Historic Register since 1978. And we were commenting on the number of people who come through Harvard Square and where they come from and their backgrounds. And, most recently, right? I mean, Dr. King was here, and Barack Obama was here, and Michelle was here, and Ted Cruz was here, and Mayor Pete was here. And they all walked through the kiosk, maybe to buy a newspaper or to get a cold drink or whatever. So it's an interesting place, and one that we hold dear. And I was telling Mary, and maybe we'll leave it on this note, but my connection to Harvard Square runs back to the 1600s, when my great-grandmother 8 times, or plus 8, so my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother was imprisoned here in Cambridge. And she died in a prison here in Harvard Square in 1692 on the charge of witchcraft. So, it's such an interesting thing, because she was completely misunderstood. and persecuted in a way that, you know, we continue to see persecution. And, you know, right here in Harvard Square. So when we were at the kiosk, we were thinking, you know, Grandmama was 200 yards away from here, you know, dying on the preposterous charge of witchcraft. So there you have it, Harvard Square, you know, full circle, and a place for, you know, people from around the globe of different persuasions, different political mindsets. And when you can talk about Mayor Pete and Barack Obama and Ted Cruz in the same sentence, that's pretty remarkable.
Pretty remarkable indeed. So before we hear this nice recording that the Squares in the Square did last week, this is written by John Maddox, who's a Cambridge resident, correct?
No, former Cambridge resident.
Former
Yep.
Cambridge resident.
Yep.
What
Former
did you call it?
Canterburygian, Mary.
Canterburygian.
Yes.
Can't for the life of me get my head around that word, but anyway, it's a great word, Canterburygian. And he wrote this 40 years ago. And honestly, when you hear the lyrics, you think it was written yesterday, which is kind of a sorrowful statement. But there we are. It was a very energizing recording. I hope you enjoy the sentiment of it. I think we've got a lot more still to do in terms of monuments, markers, reminders, and that's perhaps terrain for another program about what do we do about reviewing our history and presenting it in a more complete light. That's quite a task, and that's really a topic for another day, because you can't ignore these things. And Denise and I were talking about this earlier. I think the Cambridge Historical Society is reviewing its own buildings, correct, Denise, right now?
Yes, yes.
And it's caused a little bit of embarrassment, I think. We all have skeletons in our closets. That's all I'm going to say on that topic. So I'm going to leave us on an uplifting note, I hope. I'm going to come by to thank you all, but I think we should listen a little bit to this piece of music. Martin, are you still marching?
Martin, you still marching? March with me. Martin, you still marching? March with me. Could it be so long ago that I heard you say justice and equality will be ours someday? Martin, you still marching? March with me. March with me. Martin, you still marching? March with me. March with me. March with me. From the back of the bus to the mountain top, you had a dream that no one could stop. Martin, you still marching? March with me. March with me. Martin, you still marching? March with me. March with me. From Montgomery to Memphis, we march to demonstrate.
So back to you all for a moment. I think it gave us a nice sampler, Denise, of the sound. So what can I say? Thank you all for listening to today's Cambridge Forum. Markers and reminders, Martin Luther King Jr. to Black Lives Matter, with our wonderful group of speakers and contributors today. We had Denise Jillson, Executive Director of Harvard Square Business Association. We had Councillor Denise Simmons from Cambridge. We had Imari Paris Jeffries, the Executive. And I would like to say that Cambridge Forum is made possible through the generosity of Herbert and Dorothy Vetter, the Lowell Institute, the Mass Cultural Council, and you. So if you'd like to donate, feel free to go to the website, www.cambridgeforum.org, where you'll find a podcast of this program and many other forums and details of future programs. In addition to this being a weekly NPR broadcast, you can also see a video of this shortly on YouTube by courtesy of GBH Forum Network. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you. And happy Inauguration Day in advance.
Yes, and thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Pleasure being
Thank
here.
you.
Bye-bye.
Pleasure.
Thanks for joining me.